Okay, so let's talk about how FICO Classic looks at payment history, how it looks at a derogatory. And as we talked about before, when we look at our pie up here, payment history makes up to 40-45% of the overall score. That's a big piece of the score. This is almost half. Out of payment history, when it's looking at the content, when it's coding the content, it's coding every account from a month-to-month perspective. So it is full of code. So you can imagine if there's several lines of credit, not just positive, not just negative, not just on time or late payments, but collections, charge-offs, repos. It's actually looking at those counts from a month-to-month perspective. It's coding it that way. So that part of the score is full of code. Now, something else we talk about is when we look at all that code, a lot of us think, well, the more positive code you have versus negative code, the better the score. This is not the case, or at least not with the classic FICO scores that 90% of the lenders use, 100% of your mortgage lenders use. All right, so how does it code a derogatory? Well, actually, when it codes a derogatory, there is no such thing as big or small. It could literally be a $25 medical collection, and it'll code the same as something as big as a $45,000 repo. So again, no such thing as big or small. Even a charged off credit card for $4,000 or a late payment. A derogatory is a derogatory. That's so important to understand when we're talking about the FICO Classic score. So important. Your newer scores, your newer consumer scores, this is not the case. It will put different weight on different types of derogatory. But again, this is what it looks like with the classic algorithms. So if it codes all derogatory the same, then what makes one derogatory affect the credit score more than the other? Well, that's based on time. That's based on when. The more recent the derogatory, the more impact it's going to have on the credit score. Because of that, FICO tends to get tunnel vision. All right? Now, pardon my silly timeline or my tube. They don't sell this on Amazon, so I had to make this just for you guys. But the front of that represents right now, the end of that represents 7 years ago. And FICO is supposed to line that credit up and derogatory up chronological order based on when it happened. Now, let me remind you that FICO was designed to emulate real statistics. And a big part of these statistics were, when did the derogatory happen? When did the person get in a financial mess, and how have they done since? So important that anything that is 2 years old and newer makes up to 75% of the history part of the score. Listen, that's a big part of the credit score. That's, again, almost half of the overall credit score is represented here within the tube. Anything that happened within a year or more recent is making up to 75% of that 75%. So progressively more impact the newer it is, which means this: anything that's older, 2 years or older, is 25% or less than half of the score. So it's supposed to be minimal. Again, emulating real statistics. Customer might have had a storm in life, 3 years ago. They've been doing good since. Statistically, they will continue to do well. So freaking important. Now, why do I say tunnel vision? Imagine this: your FICO looking at all that information from this perspective. If there's something up front, you're going to have a hard time seeing past it. Make sense? It's kind of like my wife. Hey, honey, what about all the wonderful things I've done for you in the last 7 years? But she can't get past me not taking out the trash 2 weeks ago, right? FICO is the same way. We want this stuff off. But if we don't take care of what's going on up here, the score is not going to move, or at least it's going to be minimal. Now, here's the part that gets tricky. That makes sense, right? And that is reasonably the way the newer algorithms work as well, but not the classic, or at least not anymore. And it wasn't designed this way. But remember, the FICO Classic is close to 30 years old. It's hard to imagine that the biggest part of the credit score, or the most important part of credit, is the score, and the biggest part of that credit score is payment history. And the biggest part of payment history is based on when did it happen. It's hard to imagine that FICO would get the when did it happen wrong, but yet that's exactly what happens. Imagine this: something happening 5 years ago and FICO thinking it happened 3 months ago. That could create a giant difference and giant swing in the scores. And yet, this is exactly what happens. We see this happen daily when something happened 5 years ago and they sell it off to a third-party collection agency. Well, FICO Classic looks at the day the third-party collection agency purchased it, and that's what they age that by. Now, the bureaus still think that it's going to fall off in 2 years, and it likely will. But FICO, a separate company, ages it as if it just happened. And then, unfortunately, a lot of folks stay stuck in spite of doing everything right, in spite of the storm that they turned from, years ago. In spite of everything they've read, and they said, listen, I'm doing everything right. But they stay stuck for the simple reason that collection starts getting old, and then it sells again. Or maybe there's multiple collections that are doing this throughout the lifehood of this 7-year period. So people are literally staying stuck. So important to understand this. Another flaw in the system is you say, well, I'm just going to pay this debt off. And that makes sense, right? However, be careful, because the coding doesn't change, even if you pay it off. But the data last activity does. FICO Classic sees the most recent date of data last activity, brings it back to the front. The coding never changes, and it looks like a newer derogatory, literally dropping their credit score for doing what seemingly would be the right thing to do. Now, as ridiculous as that is, there's another thing that happens often, and that are certain derogatories that stay in the front month in and month out and barely move back over this 7-year period, haunting these consumers for the next 7 years, and sometimes longer. Again, keeping people stuck. So it's very important. So when we're aging derogatory, it's very important that we understand how the FICO Classic ages it. And as we go through your credit file, I'm going to be aging it from the perspective of the FICO Classic. I want to know what's going on up here in the front. Yes, I want this stuff off too, but what's going on here so that we can find the quickest and most efficient solution.